Cloven Family. The obsidian peaks of the Emberspine Range didn't just touch the sky, they pierced it, bleeding plumes of sulphurous smoke into the thin, cold air. Hidden within the caldera of the great ancestor lay the sanctuary. A sprawling cathedral of basalt and flowing magma where the last of the dragons held their vigil. They were a fractured dynasty, bound by the Cloven Mark, a jagged glowing fissure upon their breastplates that pulsed in sync with the sacred flame. This central pyre, a column of white-hot ethereal fire, was the heartbeat of the world's magic and the source of the family's eternal life. For centuries, the piece had been as fragile as cooling glass. Patriarch Ignis ruled with a scorched iron claw, his scales as dull as ancient slag, while the younger drakes whispered of a world beyond the ash where the air didn't taste of brimstone. They were a Cloven family, divided by generational grudges and the stifling weight of a duty they never chose. The silence was shattered when the horizon turned a sickly synthetic blue. A master wizard, Malachor, had finally found the path through the volcanic mists. He didn't come with an army, came with a theft. He rode a storm of arcane energy that tasted of ozone and stolen divinity, launching a relentless assault that turned the very magma of the sanctuary into frozen stone. His spells were too precise, his counterwords too familiar. He moved through their defenses not like an invader, but like a man reclaiming his own property. As the battle escalated, the youngest dragon, Ilara, dove into the heart of the conflict. In a moment of clashing power, she saw the source of Malachor's strength. Deep within his staff glowed a jagged shard of white fire, a fragment of the sacred flame, stolen during the Great Betrayal centuries ago. The wizard wasn't just harnessing magic, he was using their own blood against them. The twist was a choice that would echo through eternity. Ilara realized that the shard in the staff and the flame in the caldera were quantumly entangled. To destroy the wizard and reclaim the shard was impossible. The energy had been corrupted beyond repair. To end Malachor's assault, they would have to extinguish the sacred flame itself. The dragons stood at the precipice of their own extinction. Putting out the fire would strip the corruption from the world's magic. But it would also sever the Cloven Mark. They would lose their scales of iron, their breath of fire, and the immortality that had kept them trapped in the peaks for 5,000 years. We can remain gods in a cage of ash. Ilara roared over the sound of Malachor's encroaching storm, or we can be mortal and finally be free. In a final, unified strike, the family didn't breathe fire upon their enemy, they inhaled. They drew the sacred flame into their own lungs and, with a collective heave of will, snuffed it out. The mountain went dark. The violet glow of the Cloven Marks faded to gray. Malachor vanished into a cloud of mundane soot, his stolen power evaporating into the wind. As the first snow in 1,000 years began to fall on the volcanic peaks, the dragons looked at one another. Longer eternal guardians, but mortal creatures with a finite future, finally stepping out of the shadows of the range to see a world that no longer feared them. The transition was agonizingly beautiful. Without the flame's constant heat, their iron-hard scales began to crack and soften, shedding like old bark to reveal a new, more vulnerable hide. The internal furnace that had sustained them for millennia flickered out, replaced by the sharp, demanding rhythm of a single beating heart. They felt the bite of the mountain air for the first time, not as a minor annoyance, but as a stinging, vital reality. Ignis, once a titan of unyielding slag, bowed his head as the weight of 5,000 years of vigilance finally slumped from his shoulders. He looked at his claws, now capable of feeling the texture of the stone rather than just crushing it. Beside him, the younger drakes let out breaths that were no longer smoke, but mist clouding in the freezing air like the breath of the humans they had long disdained. The hunger, one whispered, a soft sound of wonder. I can feel the hunger. It was a primitive sensation, a reminder of their new fragility, yet it brought a strange sense of kinship. They were no longer the anchors of a magical world, they were participants in a natural one. They watched as the blue, arcane frost on the rocks melted away, replaced by the honest, white dusting of the blizzard. Slowly, the Cloven family began their descent. They moved with a new caution, testing the strength of their limbs and the weight of their mortal bodies. As they reached the tree line, the first light of a sun they had only ever seen through a haze of volcanic ash began to touch the valley below. They were the last of their kind, perhaps, but they were the first to truly live. They stepped out from the Emberspine Range, leaving behind a legacy of fire for a future written in the snow, ready to discover what it meant to exist in a world where every heartbeat was a gift rather than a sentence. Slowly, the Cloven family began their descent. They moved with a new caution, testing the strength of their limbs and the weight of their mortal bodies. As they reached the tree line, the first light of a sun they had only ever seen through a haze of volcanic ash began to touch the valley below. They were the last of their kind, perhaps, but they were the first to truly live. They stepped out from the Emberspine Range, leaving behind a legacy of fire for a future written in the snow, ready to discover what it meant to exist in a world where every heartbeat was a gift rather than a sentence. The valley floor was an explosion of colors they hadn't known existed. The emerald of the moss, the deep cerulean of the mountain streams, and the vibrant gold of autumn leaves felt like an assault on their senses. As they moved through the high meadows, the scent of damp pine and wildflowers replaced the suffocating sulfur of the peaks. They encountered a village at the edge of the foothills, a collection of small stone and thatched dwellings. For centuries, these people had lived in the shadow of the Emberspine, telling stories of the devourers in the mist. But as the family approached, the villagers didn't flee into their cellars. They stood in their fields, scythes and hoes held loosely at their sides, watching in stunned silence. The dragons were no longer towering leviathans of nightmare. They were smaller, their forms more lithe and grounded, their scales reflecting the natural world around them rather than a magical fire. Ignis stepped forward, his head held low, a gesture of peace that was entirely instinctive. A young girl, no older than 7, stepped out from behind her mother's skirts. She walked toward Alara, her hand outstretched. In the past, the dragon's heat would have turned the child to ash before she could come within 10 paces. Now, Alara felt the soft, warm touch of a human hand against her muzzle. It was a connection that transcended magic, a recognition of shared mortality. The dragons realized that the sacred duty of guarding the flame had been a wall between them and the very world they were supposed to balance. By choosing to die as gods, they had finally earned the right to live as kin. As the villagers began to bring out offerings not of gold or sacrifice, but of grain and fresh water, the Cloven family understood the true nature of their new life. Their immortality was gone, but in its place, they had found something they hadn't realized was missing: a place to belong. The legacy of the Emberspine was no longer a burden of fire. It was the start of a story that would one day end, and that, they decided, was what made it worth telling.